Thank you all very much for being here. Special thanks to my committee for their help in thinking about this idea and assembling it together into this thesis over the course of the last year. Special thanks to my wife as well for enabling me to do this for the past couple of years instead of having to work for a living. Dr. Vieri will moderate a couple of public questions at the end, so please feel free to jot some down as you go, and I'll be happy to answer them. This should last about 20 minutes, and then at that point, after the couple of questions are answered, we'll go into a time of the private defense with the committee. So my research topic is measuring the restrictiveness of local land use regulations. What are land use regulations or land use controls? They're essentially rules that determine what can go where. So there are a few different varieties, how dense structures can be, how big they can be, what they can be used for in a city, what they might look like, and what the rules are for changing those kinds of things. If you want to add a deck to your property or add a second story, right, there are rules about how to do that. Those are land use controls. In the United States, the vast majority of land use is administered at the local level, governed at the local level. And so what we'll be talking about today are public local land use controls. That includes things like zoning, subdivision regulations, building and housing codes. So why should you care? And particularly those of you who have been gracious enough to join me and not have to listen to this or read this to give me my grade and pass me on this master's thesis. Why should you care about land use controls? Well, I'd argue there are at least three reasons. The first is that land use controls have been tied to issues of the environment. They have been shown to increase sprawl and also increase greenhouse gas emissions. So the reason for this is, as a city grows, there's pressure or demand to build up the city center. And if land use controls hold that city center maximum height, maximum floor area ratio down, then that density does not go away. It simply broadens toward the edge. And so you get more development on the fringe, AKA urban sprawl. And because that increases everyone's commute times to get to work and to get to other places, there's an increase in greenhouse gas emissions and a connection to climate change. Another reason why you should care about land use controls is that they affect the economy. Most notably, they've been shown to increase housing costs. That's the general scholarly consensus. But it's important to point out that it also affects labor markets because wages fight to keep up with increases in the cost of living, especially in what are called superstar cities, like famously the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, it's important to note in this economy part that land use controls are not only about costs, they also have benefits. So compared to a totally unregulated city, where you live, you probably have less pollution, less traffic, more parks, more access to parks, and higher quality construction in your home than you would have otherwise. The last component that I would say why you should care is equity. So where you live determines where you can work and where you can go to school. So land use controls that serve to exclude low-income families from these neighborhoods also exclude them from job opportunities and educational opportunities that they might have otherwise. There are three current approaches, common current approaches to measuring land use regulations. In my thesis, I review 6, but these are by far the most common. The first is to ask experts. So typically, researchers will send a survey out to a couple of thousand urban planners. Sometimes they'll include real estate developers as well, just for a comparative perspective. But there's a lot of measurement bias if you ask these questions of planners directly. Lewis and Morant's 2019 showed that planners actually give inaccurate answers. They can be wrong about their own land use regimes, which is a problem for measurement. They also self-select, so bigger cities with more time to answer surveys will respond, but smaller ones or busy ones may not. And there's also all of the usual issues with self-reporting and framing the truth. So another approach is to figure out the impact of land use regulations by proxy, to link it to an easier metric. Koch and his colleagues, for instance, measure the number of independent reviews that have to happen in order to build something. So how many different, rubber stamps you need to get, how many different groups you need to talk to build something in 110 Bay Area municipalities. And they find that the number of independent reviews do positively relate to land prices. More expensive land, more reviews. One of the problems with this, though, is that it ignores qualitative differences. So some of these things are just kind of cursory. Other things may be very demanding, may take a long time, may be unlikely to succeed. There may be the uncertainty of public comment. So there are a lot of qualitative differences that these kind of proxy measures ignore. So the last possibility is you can just read. I call this eyes on laws, right? You could go through the hundreds and hundreds of pages of local regulations that define the rules for development. But of course, these require a lot of time, so you can only do this for a limited number of jurisdictions at the same time. And it still requires you to interpret and simplify these regulations in a way where you might miss something that's actually quite important. So thinking more broadly, right, if you were going to create another measurement for these land use controls, how would you do it and what problems might you run into? One of the first issues that we've already alluded to is that these are multidimensional. So there are a lot of different variables. There's how big things are, what they can be used for, how many structures you can put in the same place, how many housing units can be in each of those structures, and these special procedures for easing the rules. So there's a lot of different variables. It's not clear immediately which ones are most important. There's also the issue that different cities have different rules. Not only do they change the rules such that, in one city, the buildings can be higher than in other cities, but they also might have different definitions. So the example of height, some cities might measure it from the eaves or the roof line, whereas other cities might measure maximum height from the top of the building or a chimney or a steeple or something. So those little quirky differences frustrate attempts to look cross-jurisdiction. There are also nonlinear issues. But what I mean is that there can be multiple rules that affect the same dimension. So the example I give here is coverage and setbacks. There's a rule that says a building can only cover so much of the lot, but there's another rule that says the building must be set back. It must have yards of a certain size on all sides. And so for small or narrow parcels, the setbacks will be kind of the dominant stringent regulation. For larger, wider lots, the coverage could be the one that is actually more restrictive or more stringent. So that's what I mean by nonlinear. And then the last piece is contextual. Constraints, these constraints are not about the absolute value, but they're about fit. So if you live in a suburban neighborhood somewhere and there's a 1 acre minimum lot size, you have to have an acre in order to put a home on it, right? If you live in a relatively quiet suburban neighborhood, that might not bother you very much. But if you had to have a 1 acre lot in the middle of San Francisco, that would be extremely binding or extremely restrictive. So it's not about the absolute value. These things vary from place to place. So what I've recommended or proposed in my thesis is a new measure that I call regulatory utilization. Or if you want to shorten this in your head, you can think of it as rule use. It's the used percentage of the legal limit. So here's an example with height of how this would work. Three different cases. So if I have a vacant lot, the building, there is no building. So the utilization of the height is 0 feet, regardless of what the permitted height is. So the RU of height is 0. I might have a home or a building that's underdeveloped, right? That isn't using all of that limit. If that's the case, let's say it's 30 feet and it could be 40 feet, then it's just that ratio. So it's 0.75. And then if I've built to the limit, it'll be 40 of 40 or 1. So the overall idea is that this number will generally be between 0 and 1. Occasionally, if people are breaking the rules or they have special dispensation, you will see a number above 1. And we'll talk about that later. So in my thesis, I look at many different types of regulatory utilization. I look at many different rules. Each of these has its own number, but I also combine them in what I think are useful ways. two ways to do this. The one on the left is what I call density utilization. So this is how dense is development now in this neighborhood or community compared to the legal limits, right? How close is it to the overall capacity that the rules are imposing? And so to calculate this, you need to look at the total number of housing units that are allowed on parcels. You also need to look at the lot area. If there's a minimum lot area where the lots can't be any smaller, those two things combined will basically determine your maximum population density under the law, with some adjustments for multifamily units with floor area ratio and minimum units. So the one, density, tries to answer this important question: how dense is development compared to the legal limits? And the other, bulk utilization, asks the question: how large are all of these structures compared to these legal limits? So for each individual building, we compare it to the rules for that building on that parcel. So density utilization matches how urban planners tend to think about zoning and subdivision as a ceiling on population and a control on population density. Bulk utilization aligns better with how developers and architects might think about projects, right? How big can we go? What is the shape and overall bulk size that this project can be? So here's a worked example of a small neighborhood. This is a 4 acre by 4 acre neighborhood. I concentrate in the thesis on residential measurements for consistency with the literature. A lot of the interest in the literature is around the effect on how home prices and land prices and things. So we'll just look at a single family neighborhood for simplicity. So I'm measuring residential density here. The rules for this neighborhood are 1 house per lot, 1 acre minimum per lot. And so each of these little ones is an acre, right? And these are the homes built on. And then you'll notice highlighted, there's 1 home that's on a 4 acre lot. It's on a large lot, so it's a special case. So notice in total, there are 8 houses and 13 lots under the current development standards, right? So 8 units, there could be a total of 13 because the rule is 1 per lot. So the utilization is 62%, it's 0.62, just 8 over 13. The minimum lot area utilization, there can be up to 16 lots because it's a 16 acre neighborhood, but there are only 13. So it's a 0.81 lot utilization. And when you multiply these together, you get a very intuitive interpretation of 0.5. There are half as many units right now as there could be under optimal conditions, right? And that makes sense because we have 8 units. If we subdivided everything to the minimum, we would have up to 16. So there are some advantages and disadvantages of this approach. The main advantage is that this is a more holistic measurement. So I mentioned some of the interactions, the complications where maybe there's setbacks versus coverage. You have to look at these things jointly. Some scholars have looked at floor area ratios in isolation or building height restrictions in isolation, but that you can get misleading results if you don't think of regulations as a network that is jointly binding. Another advantage of this is that it's scalable. Many of the current studies focus on the jurisdiction level. They just measure at the jurisdiction, or they might measure at the MSA, the metropolitan area. The problem with that is many of the things that we care about measuring vary at different scales. So home prices, land prices, those vary at the parcel level. The rules are governed at the city level, administered at the city level, but they may vary between zones. And housing markets and labor markets are regional. And so we actually don't just want to look at one city. We want to look at if there's a change in this one city's rules, does it affect the city surrounding it with spillover effects? So you need a measurement that scales, where you can start from the very smallest unit of analysis, in this case, the parcel, and work your way up to larger and larger units of analysis. And then the last advantage is that it's consistent. So this is an objective measurement based on the property assessment data and the GIS. It's a measurement that looks at how big are the lots, how many units are there, how tall are they, how wide are they. So this is something that is universally comparable. You can compare San Francisco to Wichita, in this way. And importantly, you can compare Wichita today to Wichita 50 years ago, even if the rules have changed. Some of the disadvantages of this approach. Open source is kind of a double-edged sword. The data is not yet available for all cities, although I do briefly address in my thesis how you might be able to intuit some of these things from aerial photography. But it does have the advantage that it's reproducible, that other people can download the same data that you used for your analysis and reproduce what you did, unlike surveys and these other metrics. It's also GIS based, which means you have to have a specialized set of skills. You should probably be a decent coder in order to be comfortable working with these large files. For just some context, when I tested out this idea on DC, the file that I produced to look at 130,000 parcel buildings at once was over 5 gigabytes large. So you'd need either a lot of processing power or efficient coding or both. I'll talk briefly about two important theoretical connections. And for my public audience, if you've never heard of these words before, I'll explain them in just a moment. Hopefully you'll be able to follow along. So one connection is the elasticity of housing supply. And this idea is how many homes will be constructed in response to an increase in demand. If more people suddenly want to move into an area, right, and the price increases, then your ordinary basic economics says that the supply should increase as well. Well, how fast that happens is elasticity. So imagine two towns. One has really high RDU, it's already built up, and one has really low. The high RDU town has no room left for new units under the law. So when that density utilization is high, elasticity will be low. The price will increase more without a change in supply. The other idea I want to share today is land leverage. And this idea is how much of home prices is attributable to the land. So if you own a home, you know that the price is the price of the house, the building, and also the price of the land that it sits on. The house actually typically loses value with wear and tear. So why do they sell for more over time? Well, it's the value of the land. As more people want to move in, the land prices increase, and your land leverage, how much of your property value is your land, increases as well. So this generates kind of a natural theory of neighborhood change. As more people want to move in, the land prices rise. There's a strong incentive to subdivide. If you're on an acre and you could have 4 people live there on quarter acres, you could sell to 4 people and make money, right? So there's an incentive to subdivide. But if the land use controls prevent that, then instead of subdividing, there'll be a sorting process where the land will get so expensive that only wealthier people can move in. They'll take over kind of these starter homes. They'll expand them, tear them down, or rebuild to the biggest lot lines. And so this is what I call the McMansion problem. So land leverage will drive RDU to 1. It'll increase the density utilization until a limit. And after that, it will drive the bulk utilization instead. That's the prediction here. So to close, I'll mention a couple of applications especially for my public viewers that you might see. My main idea for how the public might use utilization is a bulk score. So I propose this formula in my thesis that other people can take and reuse. And my idea for this is a build score so that you could see what you could add to your property before you buy. So in the same way that walk score, you may have seen a walk score if you've looked for an apartment or a house on Redfin or Zillow recently. Walk score really made people interested in living in mixed use areas, right? Build score could make people more interested in buying properties with redevelopment potential. And then the last one that I'll talk about now is the impact on policymaking. I like to think that density utilization and bulk utilization will help activists and officials both focus their discussion and their recommendations on the meaningful constraints and not simply kind of the more housing, less housing, YIMBY, NIMBY discussion that's kind of at a gridlock in a lot of these big cities. So I'll answer the other two if there's time, if people are curious. They're kind of the more academic approaches, but I want to thank all of you for attending. And I'll now turn it over to Dr. Vieri to mediate questions.
Thank you very much, Trey. Are there, dear members of the public audience, any immediate questions? None whatsoever? Well, in which case, oh,
I see.
Chris.
Yes, of course I have a question.
Of course you do.
Yes, nicely done, Trey. I really enjoyed this presentation. So I just want to push you a little bit, or maybe not push you, but just ask you a question. So the example you gave was a simple example of having 16 acres, 8 of which were available, and the RDU was very easy to comprehend and explain. And it makes sense in the real world as well. So a more complex one is when you have sort of unbulked out areas, where you have a house that's not at its legal limit. It could go up another floor, or maybe a house that's not occupying as much as it could occupy of the parcel, in which case there's a significant cost of demolition or renovation or something of that sort. Is that something you've thought about as to whether that could be incorporated? Like, these are not equal kind of build out in some sense metrics.
Yes. So that particular issue, thinking about kind of the quantity of development versus the quality of development, is the reason I added the bulk utilization metric in addition to the density. I started by thinking about density, but I realized that if I looked at some of the bulk utilization as well, then I could not only understand whether development was increasing or decreasing in an area, I could also potentially understand the character of the development. So in a section in my thesis, I talk about the regulatory utilization as an indicator of neighborhood change. And I come up with a couple of different scenarios and how they might appear. The one that you would probably be interested in from your question would be, say we have an area that has long been kind of a sleepy suburb, but right on the urban line, is it going to be redeveloped into something larger? Well, you can actually answer that question with these two. If the density utilization is very low, then there's potentially a high value to redeveloping. If you have one home and you could, flip that into an apartment complex, then, real estate developers will figure that out and will maximize the density utilization. If that single family neighborhood is zoned single family, such that regardless of what the pressures are, it can't grow vertically or grow in units, then what I propose that you'll see instead is an increase in bulk utilization. You will see this kind of sorting where people who don't want to pay the property taxes anymore, who want to cash out and use that as their nest egg or whatever, will move out, and the people that will move in will be what I very academically call fancy people, who won't be content with the little starter home as it was 50 years ago. They will tear it down and build it back up. The key with that is the bulk utilization will capture that. It'll capture that difference. So if the small house will have a much lower value than the larger one that appears later. Does that answer your question, Chris?
Yes, thank you.
Do we have more questions? I have one for the public section, Trey. How are you dealing with the historic variances and grandfathering, in the sense? The question, there is a piece in the National Geographic a while ago, essentially suggesting that, I forget the precise percentage, that about 40 to 50% of Manhattan could not be rebuilt today according to existing zoning regulations. So how do you deal with that problem, that what is currently built might actually not be in compliance with existing regulation?
Well, for the benefit of the public, I will add a little bit about why that happens. There's an idea about the origin of land use, a lot of land use regulations, particularly in residential areas, that's called fiscal zoning. The idea is that the current property owners are trying to control their property tax, their property values and their property taxes through political action in zoning. And so what they will do is they will try to make sure that the people who move in later are carrying their weight in some sense, that they are going to pay more in property taxes than they collect in public services. And so this theoretically is the reason why single family neighborhoods really, really don't like multifamily projects, because the suspicion is that people will move in who will have a lot of kids, and so they'll, you know, clog up the local school system, that they'll have a lot of cars, and so they'll clog up the streets, and they will wind up taking more in benefits than they get in taxes. So this non-compliance happens in a lot of cases because of what's called downzoning, where people will change the rules after their neighborhood is pretty much built, so that anybody who tries to move in later must follow a more stringent set of rules. That's how they can accomplish this. That kind of non-compliant behavior will show up in regulatory utilization. The limitation is it's not immediately clear whether it's due to that downzoning effect or whether it is because of like a negotiated variance with the planning commission, where I want to build a big apartment complex, I go and talk to the planning commission and I get to build it 20% taller, right? In both cases, those will show up as a value above 1 in regulatory utilization because it is exceeding the legal limit. At that point, it's up to the scholar to interpret that. If it's primarily in a historic single family area, you might interpret that as a downzoning. If it's a one-off case of this one big building in an urban center, you can interpret that as this is 20% larger than it should be because of some negotiated outcome.
Okay, that sounds great. Now I will ask all of our public guests to congratulate Trey ahead of a yet undetermined outcome, and we'll excuse them or have Trey boot them out.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. If you're not part of the committee, please drop off.